Okay, so thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you. It's a pleasure to follow these two extraordinary talks. I wanted to share I want to talk a little bit about this question of processing sovereignty. Sort of inevitable. Then I think I would draw a little bit from the book that I wrote a couple of years ago called "The Stack" on software and sovereignty. The basis of which was first presented here on this stage at Hackabay at a Transmediale a couple of years ago. And so what I wanted to sort of do with this first conversation is talk a little bit about some of the issues that were dealt with in the book and what's happened since. A kind of informal and absolutely undefinitive update on some of those themes. The first one of which may be that this question of computation, for the question of computation and sovereignty that was theorized in the book, I would want to say that's really not just about the ways in which, and I think it's clear in these panels, not just the ways in which sovereignty has been subsumed by software, but in many ways, and perhaps more importantly, the inverse, how software in its own way has been subsumed by functions of sovereignty. And it's really the latter that I want to speak a little bit about very quickly through this figure of what we might call hemispherical stacks, offered in some ways as sort of a corrective note to some of the ways in which the book has been received, particularly in art discourses. So just as a sort of quick bit of recapitulation, the stack model deals with the 6 modular layers of an accidental megastructure and considers how sovereignty is generated or cored out differently by each layer: Earth, cloud, city address, interface, and user, and how the designability of these systems becomes its own kind of task on its own right, including its own accidents. In the secondary literature on the book, in ways that really make perfect sense, I think, there was a strong focus on the cloud layer, and particularly how cloud layers take on many of the roles and functions of the Westphalian state, based on an idea that the question of new geographies, new sovereignties would be one that might be found there. And that brought with it a whole genre of speculative design works that were interested in drawing new alternative territories and sovereign media, passports, currencies, brands, voting mechanisms, forms of citizenship, property, and so forth, all of which I think, however, rather too neatly confuse the semiotic accoutrements of sovereign systems with those systems themselves. And yet the invitation to reopen technologies of governance and take them as questions is, of course, well taken. And in my next remarks, I'll give in the next part of this on blockchains, the ways in which these are seen a bit like Rorschach ink blocks, into which we might read our fears or aspirations as once is parts, of course, what makes them of interest to us. At the same time, the equally important inverse, that is how states evolve into cloud platforms, is met with less sanguine narratives, usually focusing on surveillance and securitization, how to cultivate and protect complex systems from the debilitating noise and abuse of bad actors. But also, in some cases, the personal withdrawal from what is seen as an illegitimate forms of publicity altogether. The paradoxes of radical openness and radical privacy are intensified against each other. Everyday acts that are equally technical and theological, procedural and ritual, such as tape over webcams, a bit like Ash Wednesday rituals, a mark right over the pineal eye. Both sensible and ceremonial, both effective tactical counter design at the edge of the network, and warding spell. Now, the other point which just sort of underscores that the question of sovereignty that was dealt with in the book is not very importantly just at this cloud layer, but really importantly is tried to be dealt with at the other ones as well. And so very quickly, the earth layer, it's really not just about energy, but how energy infrastructures determine social relations, or at least can, and must be understood in this way. Unfortunately, perhaps the theoretical interest in energy sourcing and mineral flows, and how forms of matter now interoperate struggles a bit too much, I think, under the mystifications of new materialist intuitionism. But the primary problems of sovereignty at the Earth layer have everything to do with the absence of a kind of agency and actors, the cities or city-states, the agencies that might be necessary for massive carbon remediation, capture, wide-scale fourth-generation nuclear, carbon pricing, massive rewilding corridors, and so forth and so on. It's precisely the absence of the sovereign agent that is most pressing here. And I'll speak about the cloud layer a little bit in a moment, where it's sort of actually at the end. But at the city layer, it would seem that it's here that the diverse practices of what Yukhui calls cosmotechnics are played out in and among multiple assemblages. It's where the metropolitan singularities and the networks of quasi-sovereign city-states hold the recursive relationships to national territories at a kind of arm's length. Cities as the capitals of territories under some certain senses, or territories and in other ones, the peripheral territories as the metropolitan's extended jurisdiction. The countryside essentially is a kind of massive back office to the metropolitan core. And this dynamic, of course, has led to a kind of, has framed as one of the causes of the rise of populist politics from Milwaukee to Manila, as the scope of class and ethnic conflicts is drawn from every urban core to every remote District 13 and back again. And as said, the countryside is in many ways where the cloud actually lives, in data centers, logistics archipelagos, and other megastructures largely unoccupied, as it so happens to be, by hominids, and yet form a different kind of urbanism and of a different sort. And this is nothing to say about the other issues around the proliferation of exceptional zones and political and economic sorts as well, which would take much longer to get into. At the address layer, which I'll talk also in the sort of the second talk a little bit around blockchains, this is where some of these issues of the identity and identification and the question and the sovereignty of the generic and the categorical, the really imperative categories that these imply gets particularly sorted out. And we see this in many ways from simple things like device identification to other more newer, more comprehensive and perhaps pernicious initiatives around social ID, particularly the Chinese stack, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. The interface layer, as said, is really where one system comes to see each other. It's where the terms by which one part of a system is able to recognize another part of the system. It's where, in other words, where governance and biosemiotics collaborate. It's at the interface layer that multiple diagrams close perceptions, close perceptual loops into fixed cognitive frames. These in turn form the interfacial regimes which become those standardizing forms by which content is untethered from the real on behalf of the motivations of self-reinforcing micro-mythologies, symbolic relations freely substituted for causal ones. Also, interfaces, it must be said, is not only how users look at the world, it's also the way in which the world in other ways looks at itself. It's also where the sensing assemblages that feed the input layer of landscape scale deep learning, artificial neural networks, here that the strangely alien / familiar worlds and the intraspecies signaling dynamics that ensue takes place. The fragility of fragility of agency, let's say, and the boundaries of agents literally are drawn, of course, at the user layer, but including but not limited to the status, that the fragility, not limited to, inclusive but not limited to the status of human and humanism in all of this, of individuation and collectivization, of encapsulation and prostheticization and so forth. Also the polyphony of imaginaries for AI and evolutionary robotics, perhaps more importantly, may be trained exactly here. And we may see an unfortunate standardization of corporeal cultures as projected into that common virtualization. Or we may see a kind of negentropic proliferation of co-agencies unaccountable by industrial era political economic theory. Certainly to say. Also, the contestations of sovereign identification and identity are fought, sometimes one idea at a time, in such forms. For some, identity theft is when someone else has a depersonalization episode and then repersonalizes as you instead. For others, the trace of address is not so easily dislodged. For some, this may be experienced as a delinking of identity from agency, representation from non-representation. The former played out in forums of public mimesis, and the latter increasingly non-representational, operational, counted but not named. The point is that from the stack thesis model, the dynamics of sovereignty at each layer operate at each layer and recognize and conflict with one another in the same way. There is no one layer within the model by which software and sovereignty is more truly and properly located, radiating from there. It's certainly not the cloud layer. It's precisely this contestation in ways that are not recognizably political that is perhaps most important. The multiples of those mapping complexities ensue. And because those fundamental procedures of governance, and thereby the fundamental procedures of governance, which we might say of replication, recursion, and enforcement, are all the more widespread, more imminent. That said, it also does include, however, all of the institutional geographies that are recognizably political. The post-Westphalian machinations of cloud platforms, drawing a new nomos, by abstracting and absorbing functions from the state, for example, but is only one side of the story. New sovereign territories, I want to sort of underscore, are also drawn in parallel domains to the state, but can be imagined as configured and as diffuse and discontiguous incorporations from there. In each of which are ways that would redefine and reposition how we would locate this problem of placement. That is, it's not only then that the cloud platforms absorb and redraw the functions of the state according to their more gossamer topologies. The production of new territories occurs as much, if not more so, by how states absorb the functions of the cloud and indeed become cloud platforms. So instead of thinking of new spaces as something developed in opposition to the states, which is understood then as a kind of fixed model, a landlocked entity against which liquid flows may swim, we need to also see that states are producing new territories, and perhaps some ways more important ones, for good or bad, as the state itself is actively respatialized as a stack. And I'll talk a little bit about this a bit more informally at the relative continuity of those spaces may span from a kind of hard enclosure within a bounded territorial domain to transoceanic atmospheric encapsulations through informational securitization and monetization, of course. Now, the argument I would propose and would need consider more time to sort of draw out, and this is some of what the next, at least one of the chapters in the next book will do so, is a bit more like Schmidt's Grossraum than it is like, for example, the kind of neo-cameralist patchwork multiplication of Westphalian enclaves, though we see that too with certain private polities proliferate. That is to say, what we see instead is the emergence of not one global stack, but a mitosis of the stack genera into a regime of multipolar hemispherical stacks in which the sovereign steerage of a state, even if unbounded by Westphalian borders exactly, remains paramount. This places informational networks in relation to notions of sovereignties and the structures it engenders, of course, and here we see once more, this collision of transmission technologies, multi-scalar platforms, formal and informal legal sovereignties, human rights regimes, and so forth, folding into kinds of encapsulated economic structures that themselves constitute a kind of megastructural formations interrelated within themselves by noisy dynamics of their own self-generative feedback. their geographic scope and their procedural integration as the geographic scope and their procedural integration of data as sovereign substance are in many ways their key territorial innovation. So among these, this is sort of initial sketch of these multipolar hemispherical stacks. We have, of course, the Euro-American, so perhaps something like a Euro-American stack plus Australasia and Israel, recognized by the GAFA stack, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. We could add Microsoft if you like. A Chinese stack, recognizable by the sort of the BAT stack of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. And then, since I'm coming to you from Moscow, we can certainly talk about the a Russia plus CIS country stack, and its structures of VK, Telegram, Yandex, and so forth. These are, and of course, the Latin America concepts in Africa and Middle East. There's other ones that may, in fact, be more innovative in many sort of ways. Now, clearly, the nationalism and linguistic homology plays a role here, but it doesn't. Honestly, I think it doesn't actually explain as much as it might appear. Many of the debates around these issues in Berlin and indeed in Europe more broadly contest the terms of Europe's inclusion or exclusion from a Euro-American stack. And what the norms of that inclusion might be, if at all. Europe's GDPR, the General Data Protection Law, and for this, the legal status, as we know, of EU data, draws dotted lines from data center to data center, regardless of where those facilities may in fact be located. The EU digital single market, including rights and some of the aspirations and codes for this, including right of erasure, pseudonymization, data portability, and so forth, are all quite sensible, and may in time take on a gravity in terms of transnational agreements similar to that had once been offered by the Euro and the ECM. Enforcement, however, depends on what we mean by operating in a jurisdiction and what counts as EU data in the first place, and this will continue to be redefined by technologies of circumnavigation, both top-down and bottom-up, and of course, middle-out. And while on this side of the Atlantic, it may seem like all of this is fought in response to American dictates, on the other side, serious policy discussions have largely been scrapped, as you might imagine, in favor of telecom deregulation. And so perhaps by the time the Democrats get the White House back, EU DSM guidelines may be a default option there as well, in response to however many years of post-net neutrality telecom deregulation we make it through. It should also be said that in the U.S., many of the most strongest and most consequential contestations over the nature of sex happens inside the large platforms. Groups within Amazon, within Google, within Facebook, arguing and building in relationship what the structure and layers and content and facilities within each of these the stack structure within each of these platforms may be or should be, are led not just by technical efficiency or microeconomic incentive, but also by more longer-term thinking about the fundamental function of these platforms as social systems. Now, as in the US, today as the wind blows towards interest in more state oversight for private cloud platforms, however, often to ensure that information is not biased or socially malicious, it's sometimes interesting to note. It's important to note that most of this discussion in the U.S. is being had around the governance of algorithmic governance, let's call it, in ways that are quite, I think, myopically Western. In that the notion for of immediate oversight of these flows takes place in a context in which the notion that the Chinese stack may have already provide a model for what this looks like isn't considered or understood that it even exists. The Chinese stack, as many of us are familiar, is one that's, again, dominated not just by Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba, but a number of other sort of players, but offers forms and structures of social integration, and urban and social integration with information that have homologies with the Euro-American stack, but are also quite differently. And is also defined by a certain kind of prophylactic exclusion of other kinds of apps. Skype was recently moved out, the same way LinkedIn had been kicked out of Russia, and the rest of this as well is also at the Huawei at the firmware router and the rest of this. Another thing also to think about in terms of the structures of these kinds of stacks, not only whether or not China does end up annexing the Congo or not, but that all of these stacks are also developing, are also making massive investments in AI development, and to the extent to which the AI really evolves in relationship what it's possible for the AI to sense, that the world in which it's sensed will increasingly take place within the boundaries of certain kinds of hemispherical firewalls. And that will be a certain way a kind of territorial limit for its development. For those of you sort of interested in the relationship, what happens when you completely deprivatize the cloud and to look into relationships of structure, you should of state operational control. Would invite you to take a look at some of the Communist Party apps in China, of which there are hundreds, which are designed particularly to motivate people's participation in various kinds of ideological exercises. We're also interested, and this is some of the work we're doing, also I should say, by the way, in our Strelka program for next year on these issues of the China stack. We're really interested in the functions of credit systems and the ways in which credit systems work as another kind of tokenization, a kind of tokenization relationship to kind of a futural projection. Zima credit, which is by Alibaba, is an Alibaba one, is one that's sort of enormously interesting. Is enormously interesting and quite popular. But the Sesame's credit, which some of you probably know, which hasn't quite gone online, which is also not just the sort of economic credit score kind of system, but also has to do with the political, the sort of political conformity that the users are able to demonstrate in relation to one another, and so that the content of one's posts, the content of the posts of one's friends, the kinds of participation which she does is what makes this number go up or down in ways in which are probably which would have certainly kinds of detrimental effects on the ways in which we might think about these operations to work. So it's a bit like, in a certain way, the kind of Equifax score that we have in the United States, but instead of, but not just the viability of likely to repayment of debt, but in a certain ways takes the social contract itself as a form of debt that is continuously and forever being repaid just for the terms of its participation. Okay, so in many ways we've seen, this is in some of the literature on this, as a kind of global battle between a GAFA stack and a BAT stack, and at a certain level, at least between these two countries, this certainly it may sort of seem this way, but of course our interest is not just on the development of this kind of bipolar kind of structure, but in the development of a more multipolar framework of these as well, including, I should say, the Russian stack, and as you know, I've been spending a bit of time there. Mail.ru, Yandex, VK, Telegram, and Instagram, of course, is a sort of a big part of this as well. And we should probably add Kaspersky, as this is really, in many ways, the security software is a much more important sort of use of this than it may have been absorbed. So at least before Russia is ultimately reabsorbed into the Estonian Empire, we have some things to consider. One of the ways, at least in the U.S., the Russian stack is understood is primarily, of course, in terms of its inability to stay within its own borders and to sort of interfere and contaminate with structures, the terms of the polity on this side. We may think that in certain ways that these are the last years by which we worry about Facebook's interference in national elections. It may be more. Next time it may be worrying about national interference in Facebook elections, but we'll see how we get to those. But the other things you'll kind of sort of see here is that those of you who came to Anton Veliky's conference on cosmism know that the role of a certain kind of technological thinking and sort of small o occult thinking is an important part of the Russian perspective on these things for sure, and continues to be in some of the ways in which they also understand their own kind of stack. I should invite you to do some more research on a project called the Nuoscope, which was proposed by one Anton Vino. A little bit of a diagram here as well of how this Russian stack was going to work. He was a deputy of Putin and was really looking at some sort of kind of amazing set of variables, certainly more complicated than my stack model that I began to sort of do there. So lastly, and then I'm going to get off the stage because this is really meant for more terms of discussion. we're interested still in the role of a kind of these ways in which these kinds of megastructural systems retain their speculative quality, both in the sense in which that the model is that they in certain sense exist and don't yet exist, and yet that the power that they may have in terms of the organization of the social economies in their own image, in many ways, remains just as powerful in relationship to the kind of virtual model that they may hold on this as well. The question of a splitting, this mitosis and splitting into multiple sects, we already begin to see a kind of Galapagos effects of the structure of ways in which these sort of work, which is something we probably want to thinking about encourage. But at the same time, the capacity for movement between the stacks, not just a captured encapsulation of social life within one of the borders, the becoming allochthenous, if you like, of the movement of data and people between them. And a politics of migrancy remains just as powerful as it had been before. So thank you for your time.
Disclaimer. As we will see, the story of the City of London Corporation begins much earlier than 1948. But some developments brought about the very year were decisive to how the story continued and accelerated in subsequent years. So it was not with immediate effect, but over the course of the 20th century. In the midst of dynamics in 1948, for the first time, the norms of the computer's architecture, computing systems, and information theory are constituted. But also, and no less importantly, as historian Quinn Slobodian shows in his forthcoming book titled Globalists, the year 1948 was the year the human right of capital flight, that's how it's called, was enshrined. What we tend to call proxy politics is grafted upon these 4 columns just mentioned and relies on their continual performance and expansion as a motor and disguise. It was from the late 1940s onwards, with the emergence of cybernetic systems, that the mix of the infrastructure, theory, and design created a real virtuality for trade and tax evasion. Juridical domains potentially developed into virtual domains, and juridical abstractions would later on be able to cloak themselves under a new metaphor, the World Wide Web.
Hi. So, as many of you might remember, less than a month ago, a trove of some 13 million confidential electronic documents found their way to the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Actually, they found their way to the newspaper already in late 2016, but it took a year or more to process them. And from the newspaper, they continued or were relayed to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. This was a massive leak, yet another one, in what seems now to be a sinking yacht riddled with holes. The aptly named Paradise Papers, therewith maybe hinting at the fictitious qualities of tax havens that we will come to later, those Paradise Papers tell a story of a fall from grace. The release is an emphatic reminder of the close relation between growing inequality and elaborate tax evasion schemes set on a global scale, which might be symptomatic of increasingly opaque maneuvers of the powers that be. But how did we get here? Where can one trace the origin of this offshore world? Our story begins today in London, where recent debates around sovereignty and the lack thereof have focused on the authority vested upon the EU or upon EU institutions by the Union's member states. But London has actually always had quite a complex relationship towards sovereignty. And as we shall see, it could be said to have provided a medieval template, so to speak, to what's rapidly becoming the 21st century preferred modes of authority.
The old sages used to say of Jerusalem that it is plural doubled, a city above, which is divine, boundless, eternal almost, and a city below, earthly, profane, and bound by matter, bricks and mortar. London, too, is doubled, displaced, present, and absent at the same time. It has multiple maps. Let's visit the London below and have a look at New Bond Street, which runs perpendicular to Oxford Street, traversing it from north to south. On your right, number 98, stands a 3-story townhouse, white, simple, unassuming, and currently home to luxury fashion brand Philip Plain. Now open your map of the other London, the one that hovers above and beyond. You will see that from this townhouse you're in fact in Barbados. This particular property was purchased in 2010 for nearly £4.5 million by New Bond Property Limited, a company registered in an independent nation state within the British Commonwealth. Let's continue our journey. Walk down New Bond Street to your right, number 135, another 3-story high building, built in stone this time. It is the home of luxury brand Belstaff. In London below, this is a massive Victorian building furnished with marble columns and antique bronze cage chandeliers rooted in the ground. And above, it is all liquidity, an asset temporarily stowed on the Marshall Islands by Lincoln Estate Limited, which meanwhile might have been dissolved. Our source, we are very indebted to, it's the Private Eye magazine, and they did research on property ownership in London, or in the whole UK actually, until 2014. So further up New Bond Street are the auction houses, Christie's and Bonhams, but these buildings too are only partially present. Their spirit and lifeblood lies elsewhere, stashed in the British Virgin Islands or the Isle of Man. Profits are nomadic. Expenses tend to be sedentary. Corporations transfer profits by setting the price for goods and services sold between controlled or related legal entities within a single enterprise. In this way, funds are channeled to offshore subsidiaries in low to no tax jurisdictions, an arrangement known until recently as a double Irish, often combined with a Dutch sandwich. While tax-deductible expenses are conveniently conserved onshore. The corporations that use these principles are household names, from Nike to Facebook, Google, or Amazon. London above, as we can already see, is a web in constant flux facilitated by law firms and trust companies. The web's territorial spread must outwit what laws and regulations might come into place.
But how did the City of London Corporation, or formerly also known as the Corporation of London, how does the City of London Corporation and its organizational form come to prefigure contemporary modes of governance? The history of the city is as complex and convoluted as its structure. Some would say this archipelago is 1,000 years old, founded by the Romans and called Londinium. Its foundations can be traced back to at least to 1067, when the City of London Corporation is first mentioned in a royal charter. Though actually this is purely, let's say, this is only the first mention of the City of London. It's not a charter of incorporation. So it is safe to assume it existed before. With the 1690 Act of Parliament, there was a confirmation of all the privileges of the Corporation of London through the declaration by the mayor that the commonalty and citizens of the city should remain, continue, and be and prescribe to be a body corporate and politic in re facto e nomine. You could also trace its ascent as the financial capital of the 21st century to its commanding role within the British Empire and its web of crown dependencies, including Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, and the British overseas territories. So the corporation is the oldest local authority in the United Kingdom, and has an unusually wide range of responsibilities. But it lacks a charter of incorporation or any specific date of establishment. It is believed to have evolved organically from earlier bodies. It is a sui generis mode of governance above, before, and beyond law and state. A hybrid of medieval custom, absolutist obscurity, and 21st century technological prowess. The British Parliament has little authority over the corporation. On the contrary, an official lobbyist dubbed, this is the official lobbyist, dubbed, there you go. No, that's a bit too early. So, dubbed the Remembrancer, is appointed by the corporation and permanently stationed in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords to ensure the elected representatives will never compromise the corporation's interests, i.e. the interests of the financial class. His name is Paul Double. The city also has a unique form of democratic rule, whereby city businesses, which far outnumber its human residents, can register and vote. To become an elected representative within the corporation, you must first be a freeman of the City of London. To become a freeman, you have to be approved by the aldermen. And for the aldermen to approve you, you need to belong to one of the city's many livery companies. Guilds such as the Worshipful Company of Costermongers, Fletchers, and Horners. Though mainly, the main point is that to be eligible for any of these positions, one has to have quite a lot of cash.
Home to an immense concentration of international wealth, the city has become synonymous with an opaque, globally connected financial elite, nested within the feudal boys' club, keyword gentleman capitalism, whose members nowadays do not mind traveling in golden coaches and wear red robes with fur collars at ceremonies. Last but not least, a more recent chapter in the City of London Corporation's elusive history began in the 1950s, when from the ashes of the British Empire and facing the uncertain fate of the pound, there emerged an unlikely savior in the form of the euro-dollar and its corollary, the euro market. Euro markets, also known as Xeno markets, are markets in which banks deal in a currency other than their own. During the 1950s, their development enabled the euro-dollar to become the de facto international currency. Since these markets do not affect the sovereign internal money supply, their regulation tends to be lax and their interest rates high, resulting in a liberal and thus potentially toxic loan market. This market and its, I quote, spin-offs that ultimately forced through the liberalization of the world economy, whether the world's citizens liked it or not. The USSR, perhaps unwittingly, was in the vanguard of this increasing financialization. At the brink of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was wary of leaving its dollars in the US, for fear that they might be confiscated if the conflict between the two countries was to escalate. As a precaution, the Russians decided to transfer these funds offshore to the City of London, where in 1957 they deposited several hundreds of thousands of dollars in the local branch of the Moscow Narodny Bank. The Bank of England looked the other way. The money quickly piled up. It wasn't long before Wall Street joined the party. By 1959, $200 million were deposited in the freshly instituted euro market, and by 1960, it had reached $1 billion.
Now, a decade later, the world was already awash in offshore foreign currency markets, with nodes established from the Caribbean to landlocked Luxembourg. Gradually, onshore came to resemble offshore, with governments pushed towards further deregulation by the looming threat of capital drainage. From now on, states would have to compete with special economic zones sprouting across the globe, with the authority of central banks increasingly limited by the power of these newly founded xenomarkets. Capital had new leverage over local policy. Journalist Nicholas Shaxson, author of the book Treasure Islands, Tax Havens and the Men Who Stole the World, summarizes why London has become so attractive for foreign money. It is secrecy, domicile rule, and the lack of legal jurisdiction, as well as the right for corporations to vote. Votes which, as we mentioned, outnumber the people living in the city of London fourfold. These proxy politics of people blending into systems and costumes have fueled the global economy, where the Delaware Freeport, nation-states, anonymous trusts, shell companies, Mossack Fonseca or Appleby, among others, are treated as equal entities, with these acts of depoliticizing and cover-ups resulting in what Hito Stiles has termed netscapes that are partly unlinked from geography and national jurisdiction.
Now we reach the year 1986. In 1986, the Big Bang, which means or stands in a nutshell for the moment that state control of money flows and the separation between saving banks and investment banks were abolished. So it means total deregulation, and the City of London Corporation called it a fiscal revolution. So this revolution was spearheaded by Margaret Thatcher, were in fact only chiming with the changes brought about by the institutions of the euro market. Stock trading moved from noisy phone calls to silent electronic screens and humming servers. The internet, with its ostensible placelessness, is the perfect medium for such a regime. Places are deemed virtual, and thus a registered office in the Caymans can be as real as one in the midst of the city, or as unreal as a domain name registered under KY, the Cayman Islands' top-level domain address. Ronan Palin, a British professor for international politics, described tax havens as making use of fictional relocation, a mystery tool that promoted the transformation of sovereign rights into a marketable product. National boundaries are thus expanded into the imaginary spaces of jurisdiction, delimiting forms of intangible property rights. There are literally remains of the London City Wall integrated in the basement of the Merrill Lynch Bank building in King Edward Street. The leftovers of the medieval wall appear caged, even though the bank's business is built on jurisdictions dating back to the times these walls were built. Like the wall, a relic now incorporated into the bowels of the bank, sovereign rule, too, seems to have been relinquished to the man of the city. Any external overview of its financial institutions is severely limited. Unlike any other financial center in the world, the City of London Corporation relies on a method of self-regulation.
So let's return for a moment to the streets and buildings where the deterritorialized system materializes and reterritorializes. Ugland House in South Church Street on the Cayman Islands is a building that in April 2016, with the release of the Panama Papers, the last leak, so to speak, made the news as a landmark and grotesque manifestation of this shadow economy. 20,000 firms call it home, using its name and address as their own. The Cayman Islands, just like the city it is modeled after and linked to, has more registered companies than inhabitants. One can imagine much of the profit made on New Bond Street in London is channeled into the Ugland House, linked by an invisible umbilical cord or maybe an undersea cable. The connection surfaces sporadically, a leak here, a lawsuit there. But this is obviously just the tip of the iceberg. a symbolic step into transparency. Mostly they just hide behind the tinted window shades or move houses to continue on with the same dealings with the opaque business. To come back to our initial question, what can this tale of the City of London teach us about the world we live in? As political theorist Maurice Glasman puts it, the city is an ancient and very small intimate relational institution which doesn't really fit into anyone's preconceived paradigm of modernity. It's a medieval commune representing capital. It just simply does not compute. And indeed, the City of London Corporation, which with its arcane customs and silly costumes, is not the first thing one would imagine as the vanguard of the 21st century global capitalism. But what if modern analytical frameworks aren't adept for understanding our current political and economic regime? Perhaps the secret to the city's success lies in having anticipated the prevalent mode of governance. In more than one sense, we now live in a world designed by the city and its ilk, which have created a world in which democratic rule is reduced to a mere semblance, just another empty shell. Should one still call this form capitalism? As Sheldon Volin has written, our contemporary economy of powerful multinational corporations resembles nothing so much as the warring states of 16th century Italy. Are we therefore in the midst of the advent of a feudal industrial regime stimulated by accelerated commerce and an exasperated state? The City of London Corporation is symptomatic of the rise of the city-state and waning state sovereignties.
Competing velocities make this object of analysis elusive. Every attempt to end this talk with a full stop triggers another aspect, unfolds another layer, and introduces another story, another leak. To speak in pictures when staring at the city, it appears like a fractal image in 5 dimensions, progressively revealing new details and endlessly recurring patterns. Is archipelago capitalism a 21st century spin-off of the feudal age, or something entirely different? Whatever it may be, the genesis of the City of London Corporation invites us to reconsider our recent history. Perhaps it was 1957, the year euro markets were born, rather than 1989, that signaled the impending collapse of a bipolar world split between 2 superpowers. It wasn't the end of history. Instead, it was a stealthy Big Bang that spawned a lengthy process of expansion and dislocation, perforating states with financial zones and secrecy jurisdictions, and overwhelming the world with cheap credit and new debt. It seems we have been afloat ever since, drifting in an offshore world. The question is, will these islands survive the large-scale leaks? Thank you.
We just had a beautiful outline of these flows of capital on the top end, and I want to be looking at the bottom end, because I think the technosphere dishes out very different kinds of tokens to different populations. And when I have this 10 minutes to talk on the financialization or the present state of rationing technologies, I will take it up from the 1940s again to now and describe what is probably financialization as a parody, because the people first to use these tokens belong to the poorest billion, those who are eligible for need food aid or vital support. And it is more on the level of poor economics that this token I'm going to talk about is acting out. Just very briefly, you have in rationing in the 1940s 3 different options. Of course, you can hand out the material itself. You need the logistics. We know everything about surplus dumping, and this was a thing in the 60s and 70s, but then it faded out. Another way to do it is commodity rationing. And here I think it's interesting how this token works, because the symbolization or the level of abstraction differs from what money would do, in that you have 500 grams of sugar. You know, it's a very, very direct indexicality that this token has. But on top of it, it's of course a non-market allocation. So every economist writing about rationing tokens dwells on the fact that there's a central agency deciding who gets what and what gets distributed how, and it's an alternative allocation mechanism, so not a market. Of course, already in the 40s, Lionel Robbins and I think Keynes too were keen on developing point rationing systems, and here you have the normal market, but you have the points that stop you from buying if the central agency doesn't want you to. So it's really curbing buying power, this point rationing system. And of course, some of you may think, okay, this is already very governmental. Shouldn't the financialization or cash-based rationing be the default method? And isn't it better? We will see. I will walk you through this situation that you've probably seen is very, very often in the media, the Zatri refugee camp in northern Jordan. They've recently got a 33 football field large new field of for supplying the area with power, because predictions are that the camp will be there for a long time. It used to have 100,000 inhabitants. Part of them, I mean, half of them children. Now the numbers are lowering a little bit, but still there's nothing. You have to ration. How is this done? 130 international agencies pool there and try to, I don't know if that's a governmental structure, it's probably more of a chaos, but they're sort of responsible in some way. And the World Food Program that was founded out of the Food and Agricultural Organization is the main actor when it comes to food. Of course, there are other people, other organizations doing this, but the bulk is on a daily basis done by the World Food Program. What do they use? People come, if they come across the border, they are received in those tents, and of course the first thing is registration. And here it is interesting to see that I think we are on the verge of something. The old methods of registrations, which used fingerprints and foot pictures in progress databases, are being replaced by something that's called BIMS. The company running it is Accenture, located in Washington and Arlington, right next to the Pentagon. So they have a very biased idea, I guess, of who should be registered how biometrically. And the new BIMS database is, of course, geared towards biometric capture of people who are probably not even registered in their home countries and who get or have to receive aid. It's an iris scan and fingerprint combination. And every night, these technologies geared towards working in the desert. Of course, every night you can store very many data sets on it, and then it's linked and channeled, and then we have one firewall, and it goes to Geneva on a global scale. I mean, the World Food Program has, of course, operations running everywhere, not just in northern Jordan, and this data is sent via every channel towards the central database. Once you're registered, you can enter the camp, and still there's in-kind rationing. It costs a lot of time. Of course, there still are some paper vouchers. These are from Zatri camp, which in the beginning used paper vouchers, which are in the agencies are very, very good at evaluating their own modes of transfer, and statistics say that this is very favorable for women, for example. So once you start financialization rationing, it tends to end up in the head of men. The main achievement, and it was in the Daily News in Germany as a very, very good development, is the one card. Here you see one that is issued by the World Food Programme in combination with MasterCard, Visa card, provided these cards too. Of course, they're a bit more smart than our usual credit cards. They have 3D holograms and barcodes, and to enable enforcement, they can store all kinds of data. And this is, of course, very, very helpful if you have 130 donors. They can all book wallets into this one thing. And it's, of course, good in another way if you're a refugee and you're at a cashier, not only in camps, I mean, some live in cities. It's less discriminatory. But as Gerald Nestler was mentioning the other day, in a way, there are people who are too poor to be indebted, and what do they get? They get a credit card, and they're heralded. This is heralded not as food aid, but as food assistance. So suddenly, you do not have any capital, but you're sort of you're an entrepreneur with this card. So it gives a very, very weird role to the person who obtains the card. Most crucially, probably, that there is the Scope platform lies behind this one. It can register biometrically too, but what it can register is not only the information of who got how much, but it is technically possible to say that who did what after he received a ration, and that's the big change. So with financialization of rationing, you have not only the technological change, you have a change in the mode it is done, because a tendency, and that's a global tendency when it comes to social nets, building social nets in states, you have no longer an unconditional transfer. That was the mode from the 40s, but you have conditional cash transfers, CCTs. And these CCTs say, okay, once you got your daily ration, please help us build this large field of solar generators, or please dig a well, or please send your children to school, please do an IT course, please vaccinate your children. So as you can see, and this is why I would call it a money that has a different dimension. You cannot only make things that are usually work-related, but you can steer behavior in a way. So it may be due to Amartya Sen's capability turn and the new ways of creating environments that are nudging people into certain behaviors, which are very, very much discussed in development politics. And I think this is sort of nested into the card once it becomes a cash-based transfer, which is, in a way, the weird news. So, of course, it doesn't stop here. You can pay in the supermarket. It's, of course, a Safeway supermarket and a Tasweed supermarket from Jordan with your iris. So I guess we're safe to say that these persons become their own tokens, or that their identity is somehow not infringible anymore, because the World Food Programme is dealing a lot with resettlement fraud, which is an interesting new way of doing illegal things that you register twice or something. Another way, just if we leave the camp, is not done so much in Jordan, but the smart ways of conferring rationing to people, of course, because of the African development, are very often transferred via mobile phone. And behind this is this success story of M-Pesa in Kenya that many of you may know. Airtime, so the time you spoke to somebody, turned into a token, or was tokenized and turned into something others could redeem for money, and that was across countries, so it was a very, very useful development. And of course, the World Food Programme uses this technology too. And just this August, the back end is no longer done by Visa and MasterCard so much, but there are tendencies to use the blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, for saving all this information in the field and saving it in distributed ledgers, of course. So that may, again, diminish transaction costs. Probably everything here is narrated as a success story in this field because, of course, you save costs at every end if you use this new technology. I've read only one evaluation that said, okay, maybe all this technology costs something too, and maybe it's not working all the time, but in the end, there may be good reasons that the World Food Programme does it, but as Katja Linskov-Jacobs and Christine Berger-Tover-Sandvik have shown for the accounting practices of the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, the accountability there is on the highest level, so they really know everything about every movement, and they both maintain that it's not only probably a bad thing or a difficult thing for the people on the ground, but that this may be probably a laboratory for future types of money. So that was what I wanted to add to end up in the present. Thank you so much.